So welcome to all of you. We are 13 on the screen, and this is part 6 of our environmental justice series with David Deese. And he doesn't look tired at all. So I'm going to say that I don't need to introduce him because you are the same people who have been here all along. And as I said before, I'm so grateful for your dedication to this topic. And we hope that we will leave at the end of it with various suggestions that we can use to change and help our lives become more environmentally friendly. So without further ado, I am going to turn this program over to David and take it away, David.
Thank you, Lillian, for making this whole thing come together and supporting it, mobilizing Ed. Also, thank you to Ed, who's not here, for doing all the recording and layering in the slides later and so forth. It's really cool because I know Debbie Dobbins couldn't be here tonight. Priscilla, I think, couldn't be here tonight. A few other people who would like to be here, but we're looking forward to looking at the slides.
I'm here tonight.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Even better.
Okay. I had to miss the last one, but
okay.
Thank you.
I'm most excited about part 3 tonight that Monty's going to lead. And I noticed that Downing and thankfully Phil also has joined, Phil Thayer, that is. So we're going to talk about in detail about, what is it that we individually, but even more collectively can do as a community at First Church in Belmont, at the Capitol in Boston, and nationally, if you want. I'm hoping to hear from, mothers up front tonight and other organizations that all of us have found that are effective and worth supporting. We're also writing a check to, the Union of Concerned Scientists or the Natural Resources Defense Council. So, but before we do that, I wanted to do 2 brief units. The first, as advertised, is to look a little bit briefly at how the UN actually calculates can you see the slide set?
Yes.
Yes.
Just it's not actually set up as a slideshow yet. Here we go. That should be better. I wanted to take just say 15 or 18 minutes and talk a little bit about how the UN IPCC calculates the so-called carbon budget. In other words, what is the remaining capacity of the atmosphere to absorb CO2 and other greenhouse gases and still stay below a desired or a target level of warming? Most, especially we're looking at 1.5 versus 2.0. There is, of course, something called the climate cycle. And the climate cycle is important because it determines basically how much carbon remains in the atmosphere. And, in short, carbon is inserted from the atmosphere into the earth, the land and the sea, and then it's returned from both the sea and the land into the atmosphere by various processes. The most important of which is combustion from the land, which releases carbon dioxide into the air. And then, of course, the carbon dioxide traps heat, and at ever increasing levels of the atmosphere, more and more carbon dioxide is trapping more and more heat. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on the carbon cycle, but basically it is an important mechanism, and it does determine how the extent of warming globally. So the basic function that the IPCC works with is, okay, what is the cumulative amount of carbon emissions and what is the response in terms of temperature to that? So at the top is the amount of carbon emissions, then the concentration in terms of parts per million, and then what is the calculated temperature increase as a response to that cumulative amount of carbon emissions. This slide I like a lot because it basically shows the overall process of how they look at what a carbon budget is. So basically you have the amount of accumulated carbon emissions on the horizontal axis, and the calculated temperature change on the vertical axis. And this is essentially how it's calculated. In theory, it's the dark dark black line, but in effect, can also increase in terms of what the amount of temperature change is, because there are other non-CO2 gases and also what this slide calls other carbon cycle nonlinearities. Nonlinearities being what some of you maybe know as tipping points, or other areas or other functions that are not calculated into the official calculations, because we can't calculate exactly the rate of melting of permafrost or the rate of melting of Arctic ice, sea ice, and the feedback effects of those. So basically the carbon budget is pretty simple. It's, you know, how much carbon emissions has accumulated and what is the temperature increase in response to that, which is a pretty straightforward calculation. The more complicated part of the calculation is beyond carbon dioxide emissions. What about all the other? What about the chlorofluorocarbons, the other types of gases? And what about methane and nitrous oxide and so forth that are harder to calculate? So just very briefly, what is the process that the IPCC has gone through in terms of calculating the carbon budget? The process really started back in Copenhagen in 2009, where the decision was made to start this up. It took, and the decision really was, in terms of how the process would be designed, was established in Copenhagen. And then since then, there are two key major developments: AR5, which is a major calculation that was done about 8 years ago, and then another one that's just happened basically and completed in the last 2 years, AR6. So really briefly, again, the idea is to calculate what is the amount of CO2 emissions, what is the temperature response to that, and where are we going to set the cutoff for how much temperature response we can manage or we are going to set as a target. So again, the first major calculation of the carbon budget was called AR5. It was done in 2013 and 14. It was implemented in effect in Paris in 2015, the Paris Agreement, where we decided that, okay, the response of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of temperature could be 1.5 or it could be as high as 2.0. And we need to calculate a budget for each of those. How much more carbon emissions can be allowed in order to stay at 1.5, and how many more can be calculated in order to stay at 2.0. And that was calculated, agreed to, we calculate to a 66% probability, would happen to a 66% probability level. The calculations are not necessarily exact, because there's some, of course, complicating factors that we can't figure in precisely, especially methane releases, but also land use changes, the amount of nitrogen-based fertilizers that are applied, and so forth. One really important report, if you get a chance to look at the summaries of this, I would highly recommend it. At the end of 2018, there was the 1.5 degree report by the IPCC. And what it basically did was to compare what are the effects at 2 degrees versus what are the effects at 1.5. And I think most of us, even had been following this pretty closely, were surprised to see the severity of the effects in terms of heat, drought, storms, and so forth that you're all aware of at 2.0 versus 1.5. Just dramatic effects. Most of the effects we're most worried about are changed by 3 times, 4 times, and even more. So the difference between 1.5 and 2.0 is really important. And this report lays that all out. So that was a turning point. It also said, look, the way that we're going to calculate the remaining carbon budget is based on 5 major parts, and they're listed out here. Again, there's been a lot of press recently on number 5, the unrepresented Earth system feedbacks. Again, the melting of permafrost, right, and the release of methane that might create, or the melting of Arctic ice and the ocean then absorbing more sunlight than the ice would, which reflects a lot of that sunlight. So again, how is the basic remaining budget calculated? Well, it's cumulative emissions against the allowed temperature increase. This is a really useful slide because it tells you pretty much exactly the process that the IPCC goes through. And so note up on the horizontal scale, the contribution of non-CO2 gases. That's a little bit harder to calculate, and where a lot of the IPCC calculations are not as exact, where they're higher uncertainty bars. So again, this is a slide that I like a lot. I think it's quite helpful to say, okay, what are the scientific and what are the value judgments that go into calculating the remaining carbon budget? On the left-hand side, the value judgments, for example, are, what is the probability of staying under the threshold? We'll be happy with 66%. Do we need 70%? But what percent probability can we live with that will stay under 1.5 or 2.0? What is the level of non-CO2 emissions that we need to cut? Again, methane, nitrous oxide, and the fluorocarbons. And then, you can see the science on the right-hand side. The considerations of fairness and equity that we can worry about a lot are, what about per capita emissions? India's per capita emissions are extremely low compared even with China, never mind the US or Canada. And so we need to take that into account. And we also need to take into account the capital and the technology that's available to reduce emissions, to build highly efficient buildings and so forth. So finally, I just wanted to mention that most recently, just in the last several months, we've had the final or most recent calculation. It's called AR6. And this has just been released in 2021. Without going into the details, it basically says, okay, this is an update on the carbon budget that's remaining. And to kind of simplify it, I put together just these last 2 slides, which basically explain that under the most recent carbon budget, if we are going to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, we have about 400 gigatons of CO2 that we can emit from here on in. Under 2 degrees, about 3 times that amount. So that's basically the very specific carbon budget remaining at those temperature increases. And you also can see here kind of, well, what are we doing per year? Well, we're emitting about 4 or 4.5 gigatons a year. So at the current rate, we'd run out of this budget in less than 10 years, which says something about why 2030 is so important. This basically tells you, where does the CO2 go? Well, most of it goes into the atmosphere, a substantial portion into the land, and still a significant amount into the oceans. Where are all the increases in emissions coming from? China, for the most part now. Most of the other countries, the developed countries, have peaked and are falling off in their total emissions. Where are the future emissions coming in terms of fossil fuels? A lot of it from natural gas. And this is part of the reason why those of you here and others are very concerned about, the idea of natural gas as a clean transition fuel. If it's a transition fuel for 5 or 6 years, that's one thing. If it's a transition fuel for 10 years, that's a big problem. Yeah. So what I wanted to do then is stop and see if there are any questions, discussions on this.
Okay, Downing.
Well, last week, the New York Times must have had an article because it was in their quiz this week about the per capita emissions. And interestingly, China and India are in the middle, okay, of the countries as far as per capita emissions. The United States, right up at the top, and but along with Japan, Australia, and Poland. Okay, we're so it was an interesting graph, and you in the quiz you had to identify what it was actually tracking, and I was able to guess that. So.
Dave, I think the key word in the carbon budget concept is cumulative. And we think about just reducing our emissions now, but the fact that is that the emissions that we release now are added on top of what's already there in previous years. And I don't know exactly what kind of the half-life of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere is, but what's already up there is going to continue to trap escaping heat and send it back. So it's not just a matter of, I mean, what adds urgency is the fact that this is a cumulative aggregation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and not simply what we emit on an annual basis.
Right, and that connects directly to Downing's point that, you know, even though the richer countries have peaked and are generally coming down now in our overall emissions, our per capita emissions are still, you know, 3-4 times those of India. And so, you know, when India jumps up at the end of the Glasgow COP and says, you know, all right, time out, we can't agree to phase out coal quite yet. It's pretty frustrating for me. I'll speak for myself, and certainly a lot of other people. But you know, on the other hand, we have to figure out from a point of view of climate justice and energy use and development and so forth, how to allow both. You know, allow them to increase their per capita use of energy, but not nearly to the kind of, you know, way over the top level that we've gone to. So it's interesting that the carbon budget also for 1.5 versus 2.0 is radically different. I mean, roughly 400 gigatons of CO2 equivalent for 1.5 and almost 1,200 for 2.0. So they're radically different, which helps to say why it's so extremely difficult at this point to stop at 1.5. But it also shows you, you know, kind of why it's so necessary. Because we're looking at 3 times the amount of more accumulation of CO2 equivalent at 2.0.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Priscilla.
Thanks. I hope I didn't already ask this at an earlier session, but if I did, sorry. But I just wondered, my brother says that the only solution is going to be a technology solution, a way to sequester carbon, because there's no way that people are going to change their behavior quickly enough. And but that the science technology solution is hopeful and that will happen. And I'm just wondering what your response to that is.
Well, I'd love to hear what other people think too. I think psychologically, for me, And maybe for others, it's really important to know that technology is changing. The costs of solar, wind, and battery storage keep coming down radically. We know that's going to continue. You know, people keep making bigger and bigger turbine blades for the wind turbines, because the larger the blade, the more efficient and the more money you can make off a given, you know, machine. But then you have to reduce the weight and so forth. So we know this is going to keep evolving. We know that we've done poorly in offshore wind, and now it looks like we might have, you know, a surge in offshore wind. So it's not just the new technology, but it's how we deploy them and the ability to open up new opportunities. So you know, and carbon removal to some extent, I think, you know, we're counting on. We just don't know yet what the best technologies are. The technologists that I follow at MIT most weeks are still skeptical of a lot of the carbon removal projects, but some of it is well proven. You know, the people that are out producing a lot of oil and gas in Texas, they need to produce carbon dioxide because they use it to eject down into the wells to accelerate, you know, secondary and tertiary production of oil and gas. So they can commercially justify the cost of producing or using the CO2 for injection purposes. So ironically, right now, the most commercially viable way of injecting CO2 is to produce more fossil fuel. I'm smiling, I guess that's so I don't cry, but you know. But I think technology will evolve there. It'll be more possible to remove carbon through various industrial processes.
Right.
There'll be concrete will be produced very differently and so forth. But, you know, that's got to be only 20, 30, whatever. You add the number percentage of the change. And partly the reason we want to look at public opinion tonight also is, you know, what are people doing? What are they willing to do? What are we willing and able to do? Because that's also such an important part. I think in the end, that's going to be the majority.
Dave, are you familiar with the, oh, go ahead, Robert, you've got your hand up.
And Mark does too. So,
Yes, I will raise my hand.
all right, Robert. You're muted, Robert.
People tend to agree with me more when I'm on mute, so usually I start that way and then see how it goes from there. One expert that I heard talk on this, he's the guy that spoke for the New England Aquarium. He runs a couple of university centers on climate change. He said that the carbon sequestering they poured billions of dollars into that, like research and projects, and it just is not making much headway at all. It's not what a tree can do. It's not what other things can do. But I think Dave's right. Maybe some of the industrial processes, maybe producing things like concrete that are very carbon intensive in better ways. And certainly, you know, the alternative energies and other efficiencies that we can gain are going to be important. But the carbon sequestration, I think, that could be a long shot.
Mark?
Yeah, I was just curious. So I Googled two things. One was the cumulative CO2 in the atmosphere is 3,200 gigatons. So our annual production is on the order of 1%, 1.5% of what's already there. And Monty had mentioned the half-life of CO2, and that's 120 years. So 2 pieces of Google facts.
Yeah, I think this, I don't have the slide available right now, but I'd be happy to send it off to anyone that wants just the half-lives of all the different gases, including the chlorofluorocarbons. But that's really important because the CO2 is around for a long time, methane much less, and the hydrofluorocarbons much less also. But then the offset is that methane and CFCs, HFCs trap a lot more heat. So that basic physics is really interesting, and it's really important to have that kind of, you know, stored away. So we gain a lot by cutting back on methane. But as you say, the CO2 is going to be around for a long time. So slowing that down or removing it is really crucial.
So Jean, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Are you familiar, Dave, with this Commonwealth Fusion Systems out at Fort Devens? This enormous 47-acre site out at Fort Devens that these folks out of MIT that are developing this enormous commercial fusion system. So I don't know what, the possibility of that, again, what are all these different technologies adding up? If you can sequester this, if we can use alternate energies, but there's, again, it's a group out of the MIT Plasma Science and Fusion group that is trying to develop this enormous acreage out at Fort Devens. So just something that, I don't know, folks might be aware of, and as another possibility of a group looking for solutions for alternative energy sources.
Think, fusion, I'm so old that fusion has its rebirth every 10 years. And I've seen a bunch of rebirths since the 80s. But Robert and I talk about fusion all the time. Parts of MIT are always strong on the possibility of fusion, and it could still come through. My skepticism is the timing is such that we don't have a lot of time now. 10 years ago, we had 10 years. This year, we don't have 10 years. So that's part of the problem. But I think all of the technological solutions that are already being worked on are worth pursuing. Mark, just for those of you that are interested, Mark just put in the chat the half-life of CO2, nitrous oxide, and the CFCs. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Mark.
And Robert, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I hate to keep raising it, but there's a lot of very enthusiastic New England Patriots and Boston Red Sox fans, and I'm not really that into sports, but I feel like a fan of fusion, nuclear fusion. I just cheer it very much. I agree with Dave. It's just, it could be a huge piece of the puzzle, but it's like we have to make some long shots here and there, but we can't count on it. And all I know is there's a whole bunch, there's 9 countries that poured a lot of money into this fusion reactor that's huge in France, and they're very slowly building it over time. And we just shipped a huge, powerful magnet to contain the gases when they swirl around. And what MIT just, I think, published just recently is they now have a high temperature magnet that can produce the same magnetic field that this huge magnet we donated to this huge facility, and it was a very expensive magnet. Now they can do it cheaper, and they can make the same field for smaller reactors. I think there's a couple private companies working on it. One in the UK, maybe Northrop Grumman, or no, not Lockheed. I think maybe Tomahawk type reactor. I don't know, but containing the sun on Earth, it's just so hot, is basically what you're doing. You have to contain the temperatures of the sun on Earth to make nuclear fusion work. So cheer it on, but we gotta work on other things, and hopefully that comes through, but can't count on it.
Phil, why don't you jump in?
Yes, Dave, thank you very much for that presentation. I've never seen slides like that before. It's really great that you can distill these complex topics down to a single page. Have times gotten desperate enough that we have to now consider geoengineering?
I mean, if you ask me, I'm not a macro engineer. From what I hear at MIT, especially, there's a lot of skepticism. I mean, I think the people in this group are probably fairly skeptical about, messing with nature. So in terms of macro engineering, in terms of putting up different types of chemicals or metal objects which would reflect the sun back up. A lot of skepticism. So for my own part, I may be overly skeptical. I just don't see a lot of future for geoengineering, but it comes up all the time, and it's not going to go away.
Downing has his hand up.
Yeah, and I should point out, it's come up for a long, long time. 30 years ago, with the Underground Railway Theater, we created an eco cabaret about all kinds of things related to the environment and climate change at that point. One of our songs was Sunglasses in the Sky, and it came off of the ideas of putting up reflectors in satellites that would reflect the sun back and cool our planet. And that idea was already floating around at that point 30 years ago.
I would just add maybe on Priscilla's original point on technology, and then all of you that have commented on it since. The Europeans and some of the Southeast Asian countries are counting now a little bit, to my concern, on hydrogen, and particularly as opposed to brown or gray hydrogen, green hydrogen. In other words, hydrogen that's produced by hydro and other renewable resources. The people, again, that know a lot more about this at MIT than I know are quite skeptical still about the costs and the feasibility, but the Europeans are. At Glasgow, I was a little worried, honestly. I lost some sleep a couple nights about the extent to which the Europeans are counting on green hydrogen. But if anybody's interested, I'll send you more on that. But otherwise, let me transition to public opinion just for 15 minutes, because I want to make sure that we stop.
Let me just add one footnote that
yes,
National Grid and Eversource are pitching green hydrogen as their
Really?
future. Yeah.
In the US. Okay. Wow. Well, that's really interesting.
I would like any information about green hydrogen that you can forward to me. This is Craig Sherman.
Yes, surely. That would be fun. All right, so I want to.
Do people know what green hydrogen is? I mean, it's a very quick explanation is basically you use solar or some other alternative energy, and you had to use carbon fuels, fossil fuels, to create it in the past. Hydrogen, basically you have to add electricity to water, and then that splits the hydrogen atom from the oxygen, the H2O, and then you have hydrogen. But it's using green energy to do that. And the advantage of that is then you can recombine the hydrogen and the oxygen, and that creates electricity that you can use to drive a motor or whatever else. And the output is simply water. There's no other output.
There are even some developing countries like Indonesia that are now counting on this as a way of fueling ships, that have to pass by their shores. So, yeah, more to follow on green hydrogen then. All right. So this needs to be brief. So what I wanted to do is just, these first few slides are very general. And in fact, I think given the time constraints, I probably want to, I think it's generally true that people in developing countries are more concerned about climate than we are. And the least concerned tend to be not just the US, but more the Anglo countries, Australia in particular. This is an important slide. If you get a chance later to look at this more closely, this, I believe, is critical to what's going on in the US and the West. And that is, do people generally see actions that we take to mitigate emissions as, if they're done in a careful way, as helping the economy or actually hurting the economy. And in the US, we still tend to have a fairly skeptical audience. That audience may be more of a particular political party than another one. But we are, along with the Japanese, pretty skeptical, whereas other countries are, much more likely to say that taking the right measures to mitigate climate change are also helpful to the economy. And, countries like most of Europe, but not so much Canada, Australia, and the US. So anyway, if you get a chance, I think that's an important, hopeful that more countries see science as being more important. Yeah, I'm going to skip income disparities and feeling overwhelmed, the psychological impacts. That's another whole topic. The capacity for making major change in the aftermath of the pandemic. Again, that's sort of encouraging. But if you look at, a lot of this public opinion poll data is collected by an organization in Britain called Ipsos that does very broad surveys of 27, 29, 30 countries fairly regularly. And they sell a lot of this to their clients, but they also release it for public use. And some of this, I think, is actually quite useful. I'm going to skip through to, yeah, so I mean, the point here is that people believe that their governments should be taking more action. They also believe strongly that businesses should be taking action, but they also believe generally across country that they should take responsibility too. Awareness of your government's plan to take action is not very high in most countries. You could take a look at that if you want. This is a more interesting one, the more important one, I think. Even in those countries at the top that have committed legally, in legal terms, to net zero by a specific year, like Great Britain, France, Sweden, the number of people that think that the government has a clear plan for reaching that is not as high as we would like. So even where governments have really committed to doing it, we don't yet know exactly how they're doing it, and their own population is skeptical about how they're going to do it. So they need to lay that out more specifically in order for people to have confidence. Again, the idea that governments need to act, that corporations need to act, people very strongly agree. And they also agree that, individuals have a responsibility to act, although a little bit less so in Russia, Japan, than in most other countries. Yeah. So I talked about this with Monty earlier. One of the things I wanted to emphasize tonight is that in general, across countries, including the US, the actions that most people say they're already taking, they're willing to take, and to some extent they believe are most effective, are not necessarily the measures that are most effective. And so I think that's something that we individually and collectively can help correct. And often the measures that people think are effective, let me give you some examples, are not. So here's some opposite cases. So people say that they're willing and likely to save water at home. So that is important. That's encouraging. People also say they're likely and willing to save energy, and that is important also, obviously. Change their daily travel. In principle, a lot of people, not necessarily a majority, less than a majority in countries around the world, take less flights. Again, a pretty decent percentage, although not the same level we would expect. In the US, it's only 37%. Would you be likely to fly less? So that's kind of discouraging, and that's a really important measure. That's one of the ones that we know is most important to mitigating climate change, is if each person would fly one time less each year. Eat less meat, again, it fades off. People are less willing to do that. Less dairy, less willing. And these are the data sources for that. So how are we doing on time? Well, let me just finish because I've only got a couple more slides, and then we'll see if people have any questions. I think Robert is going to want us to say something. The last couple slides are simply just to show that the US is often an outlier. And this one I think is interesting because it basically shows that citizens in the US are, if anything, possibly less familiar with climate change than they were several years ago. Why is this the case? Well, there's one political party that will remain unnamed. A lot of members of that particular political party are basically moving away from saying that they're familiar with climate change and the measures that are needed to reverse it. So that's not encouraging in the case of the US. The fact that people are saying, oh, your human activity changes climate change, well, that's increasing, that's encouraging, but it's still a pretty low percentage. 54% in the US shows not great levels of understanding. Yeah, so that's where I wanted to stop and then have some time for questions before we move to discussion with Monty.
I had a quick thing on the flights in the US. I think, how to say this, I think one of the things we may want to think about with climate change is the individual character of each country. And some countries may have a temperate climate. Some may have a climate that requires more heating and cooling. Some countries may have access to geothermal. Some countries may be large, like the United States, and the interconnectedness is really, it's hard to connect all those disparate cities by train in a reasonable amount of time. Maybe some of them can be done better than we're doing them, but if you're in Europe and the cities are close together, it seems it would be easier in your mind to take trains, for instance. But just a thought that there's differences geographically and otherwise.
Yeah, I think that finally at Paris in 2015, when all the developing countries said, okay, we agree now, it's common but differentiated responsibilities. You need to act sooner and more intensively, but we agree that we have to act now too. We all have to act together. And I think part of that is, yeah, some countries, Canada, Russia, the US, have different per capita energy use, and that's not going to change, as steeply as maybe we would hope it would for those reasons that you mentioned. So we need to change and change quickly, but right, our per capita energy use is probably going to remain a bit higher than for India.
Priscilla, you're muted.
Is there potential for planes to become more energy efficient, or is that just not something that, are they already as energy efficient as they can be?
I love that question. That gets into my own research, but so I'll resist the temptation to say more than a couple sentences. So I think that for aircraft, it's going to be a lot about fuels and moving to algae or bio-based based fuel rather than heavily fossil fuel, because a lot of the efficiencies that they can make have already been done operationally through airports, lightening aircraft, taking away our leg room, and making the flights, more efficient for them, not necessarily more comfortable for us. But no, I'd love to talk about that more with you if you have a chance, because that connects with my own work on aviation. Yeah.
Okay, we have two questions, Phil and then Downing.
Dave, can you jump back to the slide that showed the likely and the unlikely on the right side?
You have to figure out where that is again on my screen.
It was like 4 slides back.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I don't know why I'm not done something on my screen here, Phil.
Okay, all right.
Because I'm running out of the time I wanted to use. Can you just mention the slide again? Was it about what people are likely to do?
Yes, but the disparity between what people think makes a difference versus what actually makes a difference. And I can look at the slide deck later. I don't want to take any more time, but I thought that was a particularly interesting slide.
It is, and there was one that was shown by this same group at Glasgow that I looked and looked for because I was dying to show it tonight. I couldn't find the exact slide, and there are 4 or 5 different data sets. But essentially, I think the key thing is recycling, other things, plastic bags, things that you and I are already doing that are most advocated, most visible around the community that often we think of are by far the least important. We talked a few times ago, I don't even want to bring it up again, but I'm going to mention it in 2 words, 3 words, number of children, whole number of children aside, but how much we fly, right? Energy conservation, eating meat, at least especially growing animals for food. And so there is this, I think it's a really important point. There is this real disconnect between what we're most doing and what we feel is most feasible and likely that we'll do on the one hand, and what most counts on the other hand. So flying once, 1 major flight less each year is hugely important. Or if we cue on Robert Wilson, either get rid of our car, which I'm not willing to do yet, or change to an EV. That's hugely important, and so forth.
I have to buy more sneakers though. They have some carbon content.
Okay, Downing.
Well, just at our 350 mass meetings every 2 weeks, one of our members does good news. She's collected stuff over the 2 weeks. And last week's good news was that British Airways just committed to, I think, changing their entire fleet to biofuels. United Airlines last week flew the first biofuel flight from Chicago to, I believe it was Washington, D.C. Okay, so, and Dave, you probably know more about that, right? The conversion is starting to biofuels, and the fossil fuel industry is not going to like this, by the way. Well, unless they start to sell the biofuels. Yeah.
And there's another whole similar issue with international shipping around the world, which is not counted in national inventories. Same question, really. Again,
And I think it's pretty amazing that they're doing biofuels, because my understanding is they get really solidified at low temperatures, and when you're flying, the temperatures are sub-zero when you're way up in the altitude. So it's amazing engineering feat. But I'd like my ignorance to be cleared on biofuels. How do they prevent less carbon from going into the atmosphere? Because you're still burning something, but I guess you took the carbon in when you grew it. So then you're just releasing the carbon that took to produce the biofuel in the first place. Is that the logic?
Well, to the extent you got the same BTU per unit out of the fuel, it's how it's made. And if 30, 40, 50, 60% of is made through green processes, it's in the production that you're saving it, as I understand it. There's another whole international agreement, which was around, how to say it in 2 words, around capping the growth of aviation fuel use by doing offsets that the airline company for each unit of growth after 2020 would have to buy offsets in developing countries, of renewable fuels and so forth. And that looked like it was going to go into effect. And then they changed the baseline after the pandemic, and it's just not going to be effective. So again, that's why the fuels piece is so important. We should shift low and then merge questions again into the discussion, just so we have time, to the third part, which is, what can we do at the national, state, collective, community, Belmont, First Church, and individual level? And I was hoping Monte would lead that.
Well, thanks, Dave. A couple of things have occurred to me as we're talking so far in tonight's session. One is that there are things that we think of as being environmentally friendly, but really have minimal, if any, impact on carbon emissions. And the other is that there's an inverse relationship between what we each individually can do, in which case we have total control over what we do, on the one hand, and on the other hand, individual action has minimal impact in the big picture. So it's a trade-off between, we're in a position to do really good stuff individually, but really in the big picture, individual action may not really matter that much. I mean, it matters, but it's relative. On the other hand, collective action can have huge impact, but our individual role in that collective action can be pretty minute. So it's an inverse relationship between what we individually do and what the impact is on a global problem. So in terms of what can we do, I kind of wonder if we should start with what we can do individually at home and this, or whether really we should be starting on what can we do collectively that has global impact. And there's variations on that, many levels between the two. There's things that we can do at the national level that are extremely consequential. There are things that we can do at the state level that will have, worthwhile impact. Collective things that we can do as citizens collectively. Same is true for local actions, and same is true for the influence that we have on just individual institutions, like the church. Dave is mentioning our church. And so, I'm not sure where you all are most interested in starting. Do you want to talk about global things? I'd like to talk about global things. But I don't want to just say, if you're not interested in that, then we should start somewhere else. So what do you all think?
Priscilla.
I would just be interested to know, when you say collectively what we can do as individuals, I guess I feel like influencing policy is one of the most important things. And I'm wondering, I guess when you talk about globally, or I'd be interested in what you think we as a church, or we as Unitarian Universalists, whatever access we have to large numbers of people, where should we be directing people in terms of influencing policy? And is that making phone calls? Is it giving money to, and to which organizations? Or what do you feel, with all your knowledge, like what's the most effective way to either direct action or money for individuals, I guess, or collectively?
Well, I think as citizens, we're acting individually as voters, but the decisions that we collectively make through our voting or through our organizational advocacy are very consequential. So I'm not sure how to respond to your point, Priscilla. Apart from that, I will say, if I can just say something at the global level, I think that the role that the United States plays in the geopolitics of humanity's efforts to overcome global warming or to halt global warming is a very profoundly important role. And so what we can do to influence the course of action that our country takes will have global influence that's really substantial. So here we are as individual voters. Each of us individually has about this much impact on the collective decision, but the collective decision is really important. And on a global scale, there are consequences of global warming that I think are inadequately appreciated. And I think about, for example, immigration, climate-induced human migration. We're seeing it in the southern border, people from Central and South America coming to our country. And why are they doing that? It's because the places where they live, granted there's corruption and ineptitude on the government, but the essential reason is that they can't make a living. They can't sustain themselves economically because of global warming. I think about the Syrian civil war. The flashpoint there had to do with a drought that was affecting one ethnic minority group in Syria. And it was inadequately attended to by the Syrian government. It got to the point where it erupted into armed conflict. Armed conflict is also the result of climate-induced human migration, where people are moving. People have to move because they can't live where they have been living, and the places to which they are moving, there's people already living there. And so there's a competition for resources, for jobs, and it's just an awful situation. It's very hard. And I think the UN and some of the international NGOs are focusing a lot on that. And to the extent that this competition for resources and jobs and economic opportunity results from climate-induced human migration, erupts into armed conflict. And armed conflict has huge humanitarian impact. So efforts that we can take on a global scale that reduce the need for populations to move, reduces the likelihood of armed conflict. And so, I mean, it all traces, not all, much of it traces back to the impact of climate change and global warming. So where do you feel like it makes the most sense for you individually to put your efforts?
Monty, I was just going to say at Glasgow, people were very encouraged by the US-China announcement that they were going to work bilaterally toward another agreement, of, okay, what are the particular steps that we're going to take to meet these reduction targets? So we've got our fingers crossed that there's going to be that's worth watching, to see what kind of follow through there is on that.
Mhm.
But Gene had her hand up.
Yeah,
Thanks, Monty. I think it's really interesting, the whole concept again about migration and political conflict. Coming back closer to home, I think, how quickly can we pivot on something to change, what we're doing? And I think I look at the destruction in Kentucky from all the, every time there's an environmental, flood or whatever, but here's this whole swath of these communities, they're gone, bulldozed. Now, wouldn't that be an example of saying, we're going to come in and how could we can we rebuild a community as model communities? Do we even have the resources to do it? How quickly could, you have to put people back into homes and do all these things, but you take something like that, it's almost like a blank slate there. Who's got the will or the money? Who's going to pay to rebuild that? But you look at something that's a blank slate to say, isn't that an opportunity to say, how do we build back better in a place like that? But who's got the initiative and the money and the resources and the knowledge of the people in the area to come in and do that? And I feel like you can't even do something when you've got a blank slate like that. How can you kind of, retro, fit things? And I'm sort of looking like, isn't that an opportunity to, demonstrate what could be done? Just in a current day example of, how can a shift be made quickly enough?
what role, Gene, what role individually could we take that would have any bearing on that?
Well, I guess, I don't know if that's a governmental thing, who's coming in, do you say to the government, who's building back? I don't know. There are all these systems in place. It's just almost of, how do you break the system? I don't know. I'm thinking of that, but is it just sort of like, oh, okay, well, you're going to collect your insurance, whatever. And, the builders who are down there are going to come back and build some stick house construction, whatever. And, is that, I don't know, I guess that's government policy. Is that zoning, there? When can you just step in and do something completely different? But if so I don't know. I just was thinking about that when I look at destruction of that magnitude in an area, I wonder.
Eleanor, why don't you jump in?
Okay, Billion. Well, Eleanor, you've had your hand up and I'm eager to hear what you're thinking.
Well, I think at a national level, what most discourages me is the lobbying power of the fossil fuel companies in Washington. And just as a small example, it's not really lobbying, but the fact that Joe Manchin, who is a coal man, has had so much individual power over the infrastructure bill. I don't know what concessions our president has made with Joe Manchin, but it's so discouraging to me that one person who's a fossil fuel person can have so much power. And then I look at the fossil fuel companies with their huge lobbying, pocketbooks. One thing that I would like to see, and I think it's happening a little bit, but those of you who follow this more will know probably, is that in the infrastructure bill, can we try and instead of just building roads and bridges, which is about cars. Try to make sure that there's enough EV charging stations and non-fossil fuel type of transportation infrastructure, rather than, more airports or bigger bridges or wider interstate highways. So I don't know what leeway there still is to push whatever infrastructure is, funded in that direction, looking ahead rather than looking to just repair our crumbling infrastructure.
Well, Eleanor, pointing to government policy, spending decisions, and the whole problem of money in government and lobbying by well-heeled industries. Tracing that back to what could we individually do? How do you trace that back? What's our role?
Well, one thing I've done in the last year is, I'm 74 and I have retirement savings and so on, and I've switched. I'm in the process of switching, and some already have switched away from any fossil fuel investments. Now, my resources are not like what the churches are, but I think, as a community, in our church, if we can get as many of our parishioners who do have 401ks and various investments, to put them into green energy, and just not supporting the companies that are acting in ways that we don't like. There was a time back in the 90s, I think, when I was on the advisory committee for shareholder responsibility for Harvard University, and for about 3 years with Deval Patrick, I might add. He was on that committee with me. When we were pushing to divest from South Africa, but also from tobacco companies. And so we actually got the university to divest, and first from tobacco companies, and secondly from companies that had large business interests in South Africa. But I think that's the kind of.
And I'll just jump in to say that I was very heartened and will always be grateful to the members of our congregation who voted really overwhelmingly for our church to divest from fossil fuels. And so individual action and collectively in accordance with shared values in those cases really set things in the right direction. So. Robert, what's up with you?
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add. I liked what Jean said about, how do we rebuild things back, in a better way. And it's tough because it's like we want to help other people, but it's their home, it's their county, it's their town. But I guess individually, what I'm thinking is that maybe, just by example, like our church divesting of fossil fuels, and we share with others that our investments are doing great and we feel really good about it. I might get a car again. I don't feel like an angel for not having a car. I feel actually kind of selfish not having a car because I don't have car insurance. I don't have car maintenance. I don't have to worry about my car. And luckily I get to walk places, and it's very freeing feeling. If I move out more towards the suburbs, I'm probably going to need a car. I just couldn't get my shopping and errands and everything else done. So I guess I'll just conclude with, I don't have all the answers, but like I'm interested in where the church goes. I know, Monte, you've been involved, and Dave, a little bit of where we might go in terms of retrofitting our church to be really green. and some exploratory looking at that, and the divesting or just, I feel like if we as the state of Massachusetts are really green and support green technologies and do these things in our local area and share the stories and actually see economic benefit from it, maybe the other states and countries will start to catch on that this is actually an economic advantage to be on the leading edge of this rather than on the trailing edge. I don't know, just some thoughts.
Thanks. Craig, I'm interested in what you've got to say.
Yeah, so it almost seems to me that a solution is in hand for cars. I think electric cars are going to displace internal combustion engine cars, and that source of emissions is going to go away. And when I think about that, I say, okay, can we play that same play in other fields like home heating or aircraft or energy generation and so forth? And I look at what's going on with electric cars and that model and say, what happened there? How much did government play in that? How much did personal political activism play? How much, as someone else mentioned, did technology, science and technology play? I'll throw in another one. How much did capitalism play in all of that?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that Tesla played an amazing role here. I don't know where Musk came from, but it seemed like he started the ball rolling. I don't know why he did it, but he did it. He pulled it off. And whatever his motives were, his techniques worked. And as I said, I think the government can get us to electric cars faster, but the fact that electric cars are going to happen and are going to replace internal combustion engine cars was due to a science, technology, and married to capitalism and investment capital. And I don't quite know how all that worked, but I'd like to see that played out elsewhere. When I look at what's going on more broadly in other segments, like in the Massachusetts 2050 net zero plan, roadmap and so forth, what I would have liked to have seen in the roadmap rather than what is present is a strategy for how to find and support that kind of thing happening again. One of the things that I find very heartening is I keep hearing that green electricity is a lot cheaper to generate than dirty electricity. Well, I think we should be playing to that strength, playing hard to that strength. I think the idea of electrifying everything and pushing hard to over-generate electricity even, and use the over-generated to produce hydrogen by electrolysis, even though it's somewhat inefficient. That between electricity and hydrogen, you can probably serve all of man's energy needs and do it cheaply because it's so cheap to produce the electricity. It doesn't even matter. Efficiency doesn't matter if you have cheap, abundant energy and it's green. There is a tendency right now in this short run, efficiency is very important because we need to get the CO2 burden down fast. But in fact, our ultimate goal should be that efficiency won't matter anymore. And the idea of cheap, abundant electricity, I think, is the goal that we should be heading for. I think Massachusetts should become, their goal should be energy independence. It may even be beyond 2050. But Massachusetts should seek to be energy independent. They should own their own, Massachusetts should own its own source of electricity, ultimately. And that if they go in that path, they will discover that they arrive at net zero probably sooner than what they're planning to do.
Interesting. The impetus for some of these really promising new directions, hard to say where they come from, but at some point, market forces have propelled them. And I think about the fact that GM is not going to make or sell any combustion automobiles after 2030. That's got to be, whatever the impetus, that's got to be a product of market forces. So I think there's that influence as well.
Monty, I'd just add on Eleanor's question that the bipartisan infrastructure bill had, it's not huge bucks, but 7.5 billion for a national network of charging stations for electric vehicles for non-fossil cars. And that feeds into Monty's point about the market, and that helps to encourage the car manufacturers, to keep up, not fall behind what's going on in Europe.
Well, Robert, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think some of the issues are, I'll just start by saying, I think the VW, some of the settlement was to build out an Electrify America charging stations, and they're really quite good. I've used those before. I wish our infrastructure bill went further in terms of dollars. In terms of railroad miles, China's built like 15,000 miles of high-speed rail all across their country at a cost of about $20 million a track mile. For doing the Green Line extension and similar type projects, it's around, I don't know what the Green Line's exact number is, but I know that some in the US have been around 200 million costs to us. So, it's sad when we put all this money into these infrastructure bills and they're not efficient because there's not enough builders or there's not enough competition or whatever. Not sure how to tackle that exactly. But I just wanted to respond to I think some of these issues are a little complex. I'm like super excited about the EVs, but HEV to create requires mining some metals that are kind of rare and not so good for the environment, and has a higher carbon content than internal combustion engine vehicle. I think it's the right way to go. I think we can work on that, and it's very encouraging, but it's not a great, 100% good thing. So mass transit can help a lot too, I think, still. And then in Amherst, my hometown, which I love very much, they're an interesting town to watch. They are very interesting. I have a friend from high school who owns vast forest land, old growth forest land, and she's cutting down some of it to put in huge, big solar fields. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly or heard correctly, the town of Amherst now has outlawed the practice of installing solar fields by cutting down old growth trees because they capture carbon. So obviously there's a lot of places we can put solar fields besides old growth forests, but some of these issues are interesting that are coming up.
Phil, I want to turn it over to you, but I also want to encourage each of us as we make contributions to this conversation to make an effort to trace back our observations to what it means, what our role individually could be or would need to be in making it happen. Phil, over to you.
Yes, Robert, you're making all good points. However, that the statement you made about the full life cycle impact of an EV versus internal combustion engine, that is incorrect, and it keeps coming up. It rears its ugly head every couple of years, and the strongest, best peer-reviewed research shows that the full life cycle impact of an EV is in fact less than internal combustion engine.
I totally agree. I didn't say full life cycle. I just said to produce the car itself creates more carbon than an ICE car. So
I don't think that's true. And I've got some research. I'll dig it up now and put it in the chat box.
okay, I thought that was true, that it created more carbon to create one, but then the life cycle, the full life cycle, definitely it's a winner, but it's not. Yeah.
Robert,
I'll-
you meant to create an ICE car, not the life cycle of an ICE car.
That's correct. And
So-
maybe they've got that cost down, but what I heard was that it was more carbon to create an EV, but in the life cycle, the EV wins out. It is a solution, it is a good solution, but there's a little bit more carbon to produce it, but maybe they've gotten that cost down too. I don't know.
Let's, I'd like to tether our conversation more to what can we individually be doing? What should we be doing? And Nicole, we haven't heard from you, and Mark, if you have other things you could add to the conversation, that'd be great. Lanier, maybe you have some thoughts about what each of us individually should be doing. And Downing, I'd like to, at some point before long, turn it over to you to talk about what legislative initiatives are before the state legislature that we as citizens and voters and citizen advocates can help to advance. So Mark and
I just have a quick question specifically in Belmont, and maybe Phil knows. What is the status of our the incinerator site of doing solar? I thought at one point that was looking at doing something right here in Belmont, and
Yes.
I have to say I've sort of lost track of that with so many other things going on.
Yeah, I'm happy to report that the select board did a public forum and considered a number of post-closure uses of the former incinerator site. And after much deliberation, they voted in favor of solar plus battery storage.
Right. So what's the status of that? That's what I understood, but I haven't heard anything more. And I think it could be something pretty exciting. So as
Yes.
individuals, like, wow,
Yep.
cool, Belmont.
Yep. Well, it's all about money. The town has to come up with money now that they know what the post-closure use of the former incinerator site is. Now they've got to come up with the money to cap it in such a way that is put soil on top of it and other infrastructure on top of it to meet that post-closure use. And capping costs money. And because the override failed in the spring, that's been kind of put the money to raise the money to cap the site has been put a little bit on the back burner, but it's towns decided to do it. We're not gonna do anything else with it
To
except
me,
solar
that's
farm and
something
battery storage.
that we could be doing to kind of be pushing, okay, is that the priorities of, should we be putting some money there? Because every time we, what is the potential if that was up and running? What would that mean to Belmont Light and our energy usage in Belmont? And so anything
It would be
else?
huge. I mean,
Right.
we could even get the battery up first, and even the installation of a battery would shave the peak of electric consumption. When everyone's turned on the air conditioning, that power is very expensive for all ratepayers, and it's very dirty. So a battery installation there would definitely help financially and environmentally.
Okay, so that seems to be one pretty active thing that we could be doing in Belmont, is trying to push that as town meeting members. and looking at bringing that onto to the forefront. So.
I just want to remind you that there's about a minute left. And, you know, if we want to continue, I think it's up to the people if they would like to stay, but I just want to, you know, make sure that people, that we're mindful of that.
And
Well,
I would-
then I'm going to use some of this minute to bring up something that you all will be hearing more about. But Dave and Downing and Phil and I and a couple of other people have been developing an initiative that we hope will lead to a vote by our congregation to commit to making our church building and its systems carbon neutral by 2035. And we're right now in the process of figuring out what we can say at this point about where the solutions will lie and what cost projections we can make. But really, in the end, it's a matter of toward the end of the life cycle of our current burner, transitioning to an all-electric heating system. And removing any methane use pertaining to our air handling system. Getting an electric oven for the kitchen, and probably capping off the gas fireplace in the library. But those are relatively small things. But anyway, we are going to flesh out what this plan would need to entail. We're working with the finance committee. We're working with the parish board. And in the new year, we will be holding some information sessions for the whole congregation, inviting members of the congregation to ask questions and raise concerns. But it's all pointing toward a vote. And so we hope that you will participate in those information sessions. And we hope that this is an objective that warrants the commitment of our congregation. I hope you'll be supportive of that. So a little infomercial there. Dave, thank you for this session. Thank you for this series.
Nicole had a comment, I think, or had her hand up.
I'm sorry, Nicole.
That's okay. You had just, wanted us to share what we think or steps that we can take individually. So just for the record, my family is vegan. We all eat very low on the food chain. We have one car in my household, which is a hybrid, because the fact that we have one car, we can't totally rely on an electric vehicle yet until, we have more reliable charging stations in various places, especially out in the woods. We'd need a solar car for that.
Right.
But yeah, we're definitely, tracking, moving towards carbon neutrality as much as we can. We have an old house, so we're kind of stuck with our steam heat for now until, we can figure out what we can do in the future. But those are just some of the things that we're doing.
We were hoping Downing would say a quick word also about 350.org and, key things at the state level. I know we're running out of time.
Well, yeah, I'll just throw in that, I talked earlier, about 350 Massachusetts when, we had, I think at the second session of the class. And that's a great organization to get involved with at the state level, 350.org at the national and international level. Sierra Club is another great national organization doing tremendous work, and they do have local chapters, so you could get involved in that. And then our own state organization, UU Mass Action. Those are the three organizations that do the most at the state level with legislation, with pressures on the governor, et cetera. Other than, sorry, the fourth one is Mothers Out Front. And how could I ignore that? Because Alice couldn't make it tonight, but left me a note about, Mothers Out Front works both at the local level and things related to town energy and where they have chapters. There's currently, by the way, not a Belmont chapter, but there is a very active Arlington chapter. And then they do state work, and they really submitted one of the top 3 bills that 350 Mass supports. The other 2 are ones that we submitted. And so the 3 bills to keep watching are the Future of Heat bill, which Mothers Out Front has put forward. And even they actually work in some collaboration with National Grid and Eversource on how we're going to move forward without natural gas, or with something like green hydrogen. The second bill to really keep an eye on is building jobs for justice. That's really in association with the governor's roadmap plan to retrofit, 1 million homes by 10 million homes by 2030. I think it's 10 million. Anyway, a large number of homes, and working, getting off of natural gas and onto electricity. And then the final one related to EVs, which we were talking a lot about here, is a bill that 350 Mass submitted through Rep. Dave Rogers, who is, of course, the rep for all of Belmont. And that's retiring high emission vehicles by 2035. And it's a whole rebate program to basically turn in your gas guzzler and get a really strong rebate for an EV. And then Phil might want to add anything about Sustainable Belmont and the work that it's doing. Though there are a lot of local organizations in each town doing that work, and Sustainable Belmont is doing it in Belmont, Green Cambridge in Cambridge, and they're all part of the Mass Climate Action Network. So Phil, do you want to just add on?
Sure. Yeah.
30 seconds.
Since this is the season for giving, my 2 favorite organizations are massclimateaction.org and Environmental Voter, and I put those 2 in the chat box. And Mass Climate Action has got chapters all over Massachusetts. They do fantastic work, so I would recommend. I'm not to say anything against 350 Mass or any others. Just give generously to everybody. And then the other one that I think is particularly compelling is Environmental Voter. It's Environmental Voter Project. Can I see a show of hands of anyone who's heard about this organization? Okay, a couple of people. It's founded in Cambridge by a fellow who observed that environmentalists disproportionately don't vote. They just don't vote relative to other segments. Why the heck is that? It's really a mystery, but because they as a segment don't vote, then politicians don't pay attention to environmental issues as much as they would if the environmentalists did vote. So their project, and they've been extremely successful at it, is just get environmentalists to the polls. It's nonpartisan. We're not saying who to vote for, just vote, and vote regularly, habitually. And in the last election cycle, they have empirical evidence to show that they increase the margin in Pennsylvania and the other, I think in Florida and in Georgia by 1%, which in these times is an incredible impact. I think and part of this thing is getting the United States to be a leader. The way the United States will be a leader is when more politicians start actually acting on the wishes of what they believe to be their primary constituents. And if the environmentalists just get out and get off their butts and vote at a higher proportion than they were before, it'll make a world of difference.
Wow, I think that's a really important message to leave everybody with, and certainly one that I had not heard before. And so I think we're all really grateful, not only to Dave, who really ran an incredible series, but Monty, who came on tonight, and Downing in the past, and you, Phil. It's been really remarkable, and I have to say, you've made it accessible, really accessible, and that is not an easy thing to do. So I really am very appreciative of the fact that you offered to do this, Dave, and that we've learned a great deal.